Good afternoon. My name is Roger Green. Today's book review is by Jonathan Skinner. He's a statistician, and though ostensibly retired, he's still analyzing the numbers. He is, for instance, a great census data aficionado. Prior to the merger with the Albany Public Library Foundation, Jonathan was the secretary of the Friends of the Albany Public Library. He continues to find fascinating speakers for these Tuesday sessions, including, occasionally, himself. Because he's a long admirer of Icelandic family sagas, he will be reviewing Njáls Saga by an anonymous 13th-century Icelander, one of the oldest texts in this series. That name, by the way, is like knee and all blurred together, or like y'all with an N in front of it, Njáll. So learn about Njáls Saga from our friend Jonathan Skinner. John?
Am I on now?
You're on now.
Okay. I would like to start my discussion of the great book called Njáls Saga, or the Saga of Burnt Njáll, with a famous poem by Emily Dickinson. There is no frigate like a book to take us lands away, nor any coursers like a page of prancing poetry. This to verse may the poorest take without oppressive toll. How frugal is the chariot that bears a human soul. Well, Njáls Saga definitely takes one to a very different time and land, the world of the Norwegian Vikings, as they settled about 1,000 miles west of Norway on the remote island Iceland, and set up their own society in the last years of the first millennium after the time of Christ, 1,000 or more years ago. And there's some prancing poetry too, since the Vikings admired skill with words as well as skill with weapons. The book is not listed in the library system, but it is available free by interlibrary loan, so your soul can be carried frugally into the strange world of medieval Iceland. My favorite translation of Njáls Saga, can you see it? Is by Robert Cook. It's published as a paperback in the inexpensive series of Penguin Classics. Mr. Cook begins with a 27-page introduction, followed by an 8-page list of books about Vikings, sagas, and this particular saga. And as always, I suggest you read the introduction after you have read a good deal of the book itself, so as to give yourself a chance to form your own opinions that you can then test against Mr. Cook's. This volume comes also with a very helpful index of the 401 participants who are named in the story. The index omits some of the people only named in the genealogies that identify the participants, and it omits necessarily the unnamed slaves and farmhands who act as messengers and fighters, and the itinerant women whose malicious gossip helps further the fights. All the important characters, except one, are introduced with their family, and these relationships are important for following the plot. Mr. Cook provides family trees of 3 main characters who are Njáll, his friend Gunnar, and the femme fatale Hallgerd, whose discontent drives much of the action. Action that indirectly leads to the death by burning of Njáll, and all his family, his wife Bergthora, his 3 sons Karpedin, Grim, and Helgi, his grandson Thord Karason. Thord's second name, by the way, indicates that he is the son of Kari, Solmundara's son, who married Njál's daughter Helga. Kari is the only survivor of the burning, having escaped in the smoke from the building as it collapsed. The burners knew as soon as they learned of his escape that they were in for trouble. Kari is the only main character who enters the story without a genealogy, perhaps as though sent by God. This central event, the death by fire of Njáll and his family, has led to the second name for the Saga of Burnt Njáll, or Brenda Njál's Saga. Mr. Cook does not provide a family tree for the man named Flosi who led the attack that finished with the burning, nor for many other men involved in the legal disputes that framed the plot. But having read that far, you will know enough to draw the trees for your own use if you need them. This edition also includes maps to follow the intricate travels of the men chasing and being chased in the feuds. Notes for a few passages, a glossary of Icelandic terms, and a summary of the complicated plot. So after telling something about that strange island of a millennium ago, in order to emphasize the differences from now, I will describe the sagas of the Icelanders in general to provide some context for the snippets of this saga that follow. Now I'll point out something about the part that doesn't seem to fit into the steady stream of fights that lead each to the next, and conclude with reasons for reading the classics, of which Njáls Saga is definitely one. Iceland was a cold place with glaciers and an average annual maximum temperature somewhere near 60 degrees Fahrenheit on the hottest summer day. As if to balance the cold, there are hot volcanic springs here and there to warm up with. The island is located just south of the Arctic Circle, so every day has at least a little daylight, even in winter, and a little night, even in the summer. That is to say, summer is very bright and winter is very dark. A millennium ago, at the time of Njáls Saga, the vegetation was mostly lichen, grasses, bushes, and other low plants, not much in the way of trees. Lumber for buildings and boats was either found as driftwood or imported. When the Vikings arrived, they found a few Irish monks who had apparently been seeking solitude, having floated across the North Atlantic from Ireland. That distance is around 700 miles. They traveled the seas where the Titanic sank in small, round, one-person vessels called coracles, made up of skins fastened to a framework of sticks. The Vikings came in wooden ships, perhaps 3 car lengths long, that could hold people, farm animals, and other supplies, including the wood for the framework and inside surfaces of the houses that they would build with turf siding on the outside. The settlers lived by farming, fishing, and sheep raising for both food and wool, with a lot of hard work. Luxuries and slaves to do some of the work were either imported or stolen on the notorious raids. Iceland's major medieval export was wool cloth, made from many grades of quality and different grades of wool. The wool was pulled or sheared off the sheep and cleaned by washing in stale urine. The alkaline nature of the urine washed off the dirt and the lanolin. By the way, stale, it's because urine changes to ammonia as it ages. And ammonia is the stuff my mother had us washing windows with when I was a kid, 60 years ago. Even now, wool is washed with alkalis, though not stale urine, as part of the processing of it into the yarn that you can buy in the store. That's another difference from present-day Albany. Spinning out thread and weaving cloth for clothes and sails for ships took a lot of hard work inside the turf houses with poor lighting, no electric lights, limited ventilation, no glass windows, no central heating, plenty of smoke from the fires in the middle of the building. In the absence of books, radios, and television, and the internet, entertainment was visiting, feasting, and telling stories. There must also have been games, indicated by a famous find of beautiful Norse chessmen, but the sagas don't talk much about them. The stories are thought to be behind the sagas of the Icelanders, or as they are sometimes called, the family sagas, which were written 3 centuries later. Even now, storytelling is a valued pastime in Iceland. The information I just gave you is, for us, the result of study of documents from the Middle Ages when the sagas were written, and the objects found in the numerous archaeological sites throughout the Viking territory. It would have been known to or taken for granted by anyone living then in Iceland, both at the times of the sagas and at the times 2 or 3 centuries later when they were written. We, coming so much later, need to beware of fakes in the common lore of the Vikings. In the many thousands of graves dug open by people, of people buried with weapons, helmets, ships, and so on, there has never been found even a single helmet with horns sticking out on the sides. So much for the hoodlum in the US Capitol building. A more learned myth is that the Icelandic sagas portray life in the state of nature, as described by Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, the violence takes place in a society that clearly also has ethical standards, lofty thoughts, cooperation, and sometimes, just as now, longevity, as one can see in the sagas. There were even law courts and a combination of legislature, annual town meeting, and law court called the Althing. And the Saga might be described as a multi-generational effort to keep the disputes and rivalries out of the farms and in the courts. A recent book with the title Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings by Neil Price will give an excellent context for the events in all the sagas of the Icelanders, as well as a history of the Vikings wandering over much of Eastern Europe and down to Constantinople. In the Njál saga, the brother of the great Gunnar mentioned earlier ends up in Constantinople, working, as we say now, in security, or as a member of the Varangian Guard, a medieval equivalent of the Secret Service. 2 other men, Flosi, the leader of the Burners, and Kari, the son-in-law of Njáll, whose son Thor died in the fire, both undertake pilgrimage to Rome. Now to turn to sagas generally and then to our book. Njál's saga is the longest and most popular of the 40 or so narratives from Iceland about families and their interactions, all written in the 13th century. Most start with a simple statement, there was a man named. Since family connections are always important, what comes next is the person's genealogy. And with that one notable exception, every person important to the saga is introduced with his or her genealogy. These sagas of the Icelanders resemble each other in being terse, flat descriptions, as though the all-knowing narrator saw only the outward surfaces of human action. No soul-searching, no lyrical depictions of scenery are included. Most of the events happened around the late 900s or early 1000s, when Iceland was settled by refugees from Norway, and before or very early in the Christian era. In some ways, the sagas are historical novels then. They almost all circle around violent disputes about the usual things that people argue or fight about now: property, sex, and honor or social standing. Because family connections are always crucial to the plot and spelled out when a person enters the sagas are also, as I said, called family sagas, to distinguish them from other Icelandic narratives, which might be either more fanciful or more historical. Friendship between unrelated peoples, as marked by visits and support in conflicts, also play a large role in these sagas. The lead character, Njáll, has no family relations to his friend Gunnar. This is a famous friendship in the sagas. Less famous, but just as important to the saga is the friendship between Kari and the sons of Njáll, which seems to spring up spontaneously. A family relationship does come later when Kari marries Njál's daughter Helga. Almost nothing is known about the writers. Even the dates of the composition are imprecise. Because the total size of these sagas combined is 2 or 3 large volumes, it is actually possible, even if it's unlikely, that they're all written by 1 or 2 people. Many individuals have written as much or more. For example, Leonhard Euler, the 18th century Swiss mathematician, wrote 97 volumes in spite of the fact that he became almost totally blind at the age of 59, with another 17 years of life left to study his beloved mathematics. Or the collected works of Zane Grey, the writer of westerns like Riders of the Purple Sage, are several times as long as all these sagas combined. It is also possible, if unlikely, that one of the authors was a woman, even in this male-dominated society. Archaeologists have found skeletons of women buried as if they were warriors, with the weapons and other things usually found in the graves of the male Vikings. The skeletons are known to be female by anatomy and biochemical studies. Moreover, the story survives of Gudrid Thorbjorn's daughter, nicknamed the Far Traveler, who went west to Vinland, where she had the first baby with European-born parents in the Western Hemisphere, and as far south and east as Rome in a pilgrimage. These trips are long even now with airplanes and automobiles, and almost unimaginable at a time when travel was on foot, where 20 miles was a good day's walk, or on muleback or on a ship. Her story is told in 2 sagas, and archaeologists have found support for her story in the digs at Lonceau Meadows in northernmost Newfoundland and elsewhere. These would have been extraordinary travels for anyone, so Gudrid's experiences point to some freedom in the line between the actions of men and women. Moreover, though the obvious actors in the stories like Njáls' saga, that is, those who do the fighting are men, the actions, as always, may be driven by women. The French may have invented the phrase cherchez la femme, but they did not invent the deed. As might be expected in stories of conflicts between armed men about property, honor, and status, set about 1,000 years ago, with no police force, there is a lot of violence. The description of violence, like much of the writing, are flat and brief. They're much tamer than the worst I have read about in our current practices, such as you can find in the list of interrogation practices used by the French military in their civilizing mission to reconquer Vietnam after World War II. Or you can find a painfully grisly story about fighter bombers dropping napalm on 3 women and their 5 children in a cane field. The details are too horrible to say. You can read more about the fate of the people who fled the firestorms from bombs during World War II by jumping into rivers and ponds. You can undoubtedly supply your own examples that are worse than any description you will find in Njáls' saga. Moving on to the story itself now. I'm going to read you the first couple of paragraphs. There was a man named Mord whose nickname was Gigya. He was the son of Sigvat the Red, and he lived at Vol in the Rangarviller district. He was a powerful chieftain and strong in pressing lawsuits. He was so learned in the law that no verdict was considered valid unless he had been involved. He had an only daughter named Un. She was beautiful, well-mannered, and gifted, and was thought to be the best match in the Rangarviller. That's paragraph 1. Here's paragraph 2. Now the saga shifts west to the valleys of Brenda Fjord. A man named Hoskold lived there, the son of Dalakal. His mother was Thorgerd, the daughter of Thorstein the Red, who was the son of Olaf the White, the son of Njál, the son of Helgi. Njál's mother was Thora, the daughter of Sigurd Snake in the Eye, who was the son of Ragnar Shaggy Breeches. Thorstein Red's mother was Un the Deep-Minded. She was the daughter of Kettle Flatnose, the son of Bjorn Buna. Hoskold lived at Hoskoldstadir in the valley of Laxardal. Prut was Hoskold's brother. He lived in Hrutstadr. He had the same mother as Hoskold, but his father was Herjolf. Prut was a good-looking man, big and strong, a good fighter, and even-tempered. A very wise man, harsh towards his enemies, but with good advice on important matters. That's almost all of chapter 1. So here we see the terse saga style with its habitual understatement. One might not guess how large a role lawsuits play in the story from this. The nickname Gigja means fiddle, as in violin, and is the only reference in the saga to musical instruments. Mord's genealogy is unusually brief. Huskald is more typical. The repetition of names, for example, two women named is frequent. I think of the characters' names as the inverse of those in the classic long Russian novels like War and Peace. War and Peace uses about 1,200 pages, where each character might have 5 or 6 different names, but the number of characters somewhat limited. Njáls Saga, with about 300 pages, had 401 people listed in the index in the back. There are 4 men named Kettle in the story, one mentioned only once and another playing a good-sized role in the plot. 70 of the characters in the index are versions of the name of the god Thor, including 6 Thorgirds and 6 Thorgeirs. You can easily do as I did, refer all the time to the index in the back to keep the people straight. The brevity of the description and the fast pace of the narrative, the genealogies and the names, require an active reader. That suits my mathematical background, where reading a line of reasoning to some conclusion about numbers requires constant and strenuous questioning and attempts at alternate reasoning. Reading the sagas is the opposite of the sweeping pace of reading a Zhang Gray Western or watching a movie. One might think of these sagas more as mysteries, where you're trying to figure out what's happening. Or perhaps like reading a play, where the text provides the equivalent of stage directions, sprinkled through memorable conversations and striking lines. So now I'll give you 2 examples of memorable lines put into the bare narratives. The setting for the first is that after an ambush, Gunnar and his 2 brothers, Kolskeg and Fjord, kill 14 of the attackers, and Fjord is killed, and a settlement was arranged. The attackers plot a second ambush, urged on by a false claim of unlawful injury, but Njáll foils it. The saga then says, people rode to the Althing as usual. Both sides were there. Njáll called for silence and asked all the best men who had come there what claim they thought Gunnar had against the 2 Thorgeirs for the plot on his life. They answered that such a man had great right on his side. Njáll asked whether he would charge all of them or whether only the leaders should have to answer. They said it would fall mostly on the leaders, but that all of them were much to blame. Many people will say, said Mord, that they didn't act without cause, since Gunnar broke an agreement with the Thorgeirs. It's not breaking a settlement, said Njáll, if a man deals lawfully with another. With law our land shall rise, but it will perish with lawlessness. Mord is the chief villain in the saga and the liar instigating the plot. I find it hard not to think of a parallel in this event to the one in Washington last week, where a lie about legal voting led to violence with a question of who is to blame, the leaders or their enraged followers. But the 2 Thorgeirs pick another fight with Gunnar, and in the aftermath, Gunnar was finally condemned to exile for 3 years for killing too many of his enemies. He was made an outlaw, that a person you can kill legally if he stayed on the island. Njáll warned him that staying would lead to his death. The following description of the day he was to leave contains the only passage about natural beauty in this saga. Early the next day, he made ready to go to the ship and told all his people that he was leaving for good, and they took it hard, but hoped for his return later. Gunnar embraced every one of them when he was ready to leave, and they all came outside with him. He thrust his halberd into the ground and leaped into the saddle, and he and Kolskeg rode off. They rode toward the Markarfjord river, and then Gunnar's horse slipped and he sprang from the saddle. He happened to be facing a hillside and a farm that is his at Hlíðarendi, and spoke, "Lovely as the hillside, never has it seemed so lovely to me as now, with its pale fields and mown meadows, and I will ride back and not leave." The first sentences hint at Gunnar's popularity and his physical prowess. I can't imagine getting on a horse by pole vaulting. And the later ones show his impetuousness. His words are said to be the most influential of all the Icelandic sagas. The story is they awakened the independence movement in the 19th century that resulted in the country's break with Denmark. And now we're going to turn to a subject a little more abstract. The conversion of Iceland to Christianity from the Old Norse gods like Thor, who lives on for us in the name Thursday, is central to the saga, since it appears around chapter 100 out of 159, in between the death of Gunnar by iron and the conflicts that led to the death by fire of Njáll and his family. This conversion of Iceland is an event too long or too big to imagine, but it affects everyone who lives afterwards. It's an event not of an individual, but of a population. The Icelanders as a whole, that's the population, and it's the only such event in the saga. As a retired statistician, I am very sensitive to the fundamental statistical distinction, which is the distinction between a population and a single member of it. Of course, population is made up of individuals. So in a saga, we meet the conversion of the island first, one by one, people convert, starting with the brother of Gunnar named Kolskegg after he was exiled. A few individual conversions are described. For example, many people were saying, and Njáll heard them, that it was absurd to reject the old faith. Then Njáll said, "It seems to me that this new faith is much better and that he who accepts it will be happy. If the men who preach this religion come out here, I will speak in favor of it." He said this often. He often went apart and murmured to himself. And that's the end of the passage. We can learn that there were murmurs, but the saga does not tell us what was said and does not show us the inside of the man's mind. Theological arguments for and against the new faith and Njál's murmurs, with the usual saga understatement, are left for the reader to guess. A paradox known to some Greeks 1,500 years earlier and phrased in terms of grains of rice instead of converts goes as follows. If just one person converts, you would not say that Iceland converted. Okay, so another converts. You still would not say the island converted. Eventually, enough people convert that you say the island converted. Say it took 1,683 conversions to enable you to conclude that the island converted. That means that the 1,683rd person made the difference. But then just one convert is enough to shift the whole population into Christianity. But we started this line of reasoning by noting that one person's conversion was not enough to convert the population. This is a paradox. Why is that decisive conversion different from the first one? Njál's saga has a story to bypass this paradox. I don't claim the saga writer knew anything about Greek philosophy, since you don't have to read Greek philosophy to grasp the paradox. The proselytizer Thangbrand, who came from Norway, ended up fighting duels with conservative locals using a large wooden cross instead of a sword. He battered his unlucky opponent to death. Faced with this violence and many other even greater difficulties, the Icelanders settled the issue peacefully. The leader of the Christians hired a heathen chieftain named Thorgeir, Kjorva's son, to decide for the whole island. Thorgeir lay under a cloak for a whole day, then announced the following, in this quotation: This will be the foundation of our law, that all men in this land are to be Christian and believe in one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and give up all worship of false idols, the exposure of children, and the eating of horse meat. 3 years outlawry will be the penalty for open violations. But if these things are practiced in secret, there will be no punishment. And that did it. Of course, the saga writer 3 centuries later was a Christian. The book is also a work perfectly free of statistics, but interesting to me by way of opposites. Apart from glimpses of Christian attitudes, nowhere does the Christianity intervene explicitly in a chain of conflicts that enter or sometimes consume the characters of Frut, Hallgerd, Gunnar, Njáll and his sons, Kari, and Flosi and the Burners. This lack of discussion of Christianity is realistic, since people tend not to mention foundations as causes of population level changes that are slow and random in their effect. The reader is left on his or her own to answer the question, what does the conversion of Iceland have to do with the events in the saga? I have a conjecture. The horror of the crime committed by the Njáls sons is emphasized by the last words of their victim. May God help me and forgive you. The end of the story also fits, but I will leave that to you to find out when you read the book. And classics. Njáls Saga is considered a classic. And so, what is a classic? One answer goes back to Pindar, the early Greek poet of sports and real men, with his lines, what is someone? What is someone not? An ordinary man is a dream of a shadow. The shadow of Njáls Saga is long, 700 years long and counting. It runs into zillions of critical works about it, many in English. It provides information about the old-time life in Iceland, as noted earlier. It has been retold in a 1961 novel about Hallgerd called Fire in the Ice by a writer I'd never heard of before this, Dorothy James Roberts. Roberts writes in her preface, and I quote, the creators of the sagas understood narration and plot as no other people in the Middle Ages understood them. They had a robust sense of conversation, and they thought of their characters as living people who must be made believable and interesting. The best Icelandic sagas approach the finest modern novels and are more closely related to them than to the European literature of their time. Kirkus Reviews concludes about Fire in the Ice that it is, quote, it is a strange book not readily put aside. And I found that judgment to be correct. When I started reading, I couldn't stop. If you'd rather listen than read, Professor Jackson Crawford of the University of Colorado tells the story, omitting most of the part about Christianity. His presentation is a kind of replication of what I imagine to be the original presentation of a saga, reading out loud in a family group on the farm. His version is simpler than the original and fills 6 short videos on YouTube. Also, as a modern man like me, the professor finds it hard to avoid making explicit motives and inner thoughts that are not in the sagas, but which make the story easier to follow. Or on a humbler level, you can find a summary on gradesaver.com, a website. Now, a classic deals with questions and worries that recur in stories that twist around the themes of sex, status, and revenge. For example, another classic, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, famously opens with the sentence, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in need of a wife. And Njáls Saga, soon after the opening passage you read earlier, Hrut, a single, well-off man, is advised by his half-brother Höskuld to find a wife, and his choice of the beautiful, well-mannered, gifted mentioned earlier in the saga, starts the chain of events, a chain containing acts of moving generosity as well as bloody revenge. Why read the classics? Because they populate our imagination with characters to help our understanding, and this saga has lots of them. Or further, the Italian writer Italo Calvino, in his collection of essays about books called Why Read the Classics, provides 14 definitions of a classic that dance around the themes that they teach you something new every time you read them, and you should reread them. His 14th definition is, a classic is a book which relegates the noise of the present to a background hum, which at the same time the classic cannot exist without. Calvino's closing words in this essay are, reading the classics is always better than not reading them. And if anyone objects that they're not worth all that effort, well, I will answer, while the hemlock was being prepared, Socrates was learning a melody on the flute. What use will that be to you, he was asked. He replied, at least I will learn the melody before I die. And it would be great if you could say, at least I will have read Njáls Saga before I die. In conclusion, I hope to have given you some of the context of Njáls Saga and tantalized you with some of the story and its style. For myself, this talk is a progress report since I will be continuing to study the classic. I started by quoting Emily Dickinson's comparison of a poem to a free ride on a ship or in a chariot. I will conclude by comparing rereading this book to visiting again and again a 5-star restaurant where you never meet the cook, but he always has an exquisite warm meal waiting for you to provide you with food for thought for free. So, bon appetit, and thank you for listening. I guess.
Thank you, John. Does anyone have a question for John on this? Either the book or Iceland or sagas in general, or yes, Art.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, John. That was a really excellent summary with lots of other tangents to think about. The author or the writer, would that likely be, I've heard of some early Norwegian sagas that originated in Iceland, and they're attributed usually to monks in those Christian times who were some of the few people that could actually write. Prior to that, sort of the mythology at least was, yeah, the Icelanders handed down these stories verbally. Is that similar to what you found in this case?
Well, from what your description, which is all I know about the Norwegians, that sounds right. The stories obviously were around, and they show up in many different sagas, including historical sagas. The story about the Thorgeir and the cloak and the conversion actually shows up in a book that purports to be history rather than a family saga. But they really don't know anything about who wrote them. What they have is manuscripts that are on parchment, of which, with all the sheep around, there is plenty. And they don't have the original. So finding out what they say means they've got this one, they've got that one, and they were copied by hand. So they have to figure out whether the different wording on page 3 has to be sorted out one way or another. And they, I don't know if there are any monks in Iceland at that time. I think they're obviously Christians, but then as now, being a Christian had an enormous range of possibilities. You know, the United States is actually considered a Christian country, and yet there are tons of Americans who are non-believers, tons of them are Jewish, tons of them who are Muslim. So you really don't know anything about that. And as I say, it's even possible that some of them are written by a woman, although the opinion that I've read seems to be that very much male-centered. And the book is considered as an attack on Hallgrímr by some people. And the novel that Roberts wrote is actually a defense of Hallgrímr, kind of explaining how she got to be the way she was and what she was like and so on. kind of a fun person to be with, and not the evil woman that she's portrayed in some of the parts of the saga. But go ahead.
Were these manuscripts always known as, or did they always exist in the Icelandic culture, or were they lost and then found in modern times? Do you know?
Oh, actually, they were around in Iceland. I'm sure I'm actually guessing now because I don't really know for sure, but I'm pretty sure there are manuscripts that were found that were still in Iceland. And in I'm not sure which century it was, but Iceland went under Denmark at one point, and they were collecting. It all of a sudden became fashion to collect sagas, and so guys go out and collect copies of the sagas and then bring them back to a library in Copenhagen. And that was all fine and well, except that there was a fire in Copenhagen which managed to destroy a bunch of them.
Wow.
So, but anyway, there is a continuous tradition that goes all the way back to Iceland, not interrupted as you were suggesting.
Jonathan, if I can barge in, having
Sure.
spent about a year and a half in Iceland and tracking very often on days off with Icelandics, they definitely claim that it was preserved and in turn recopied at various times throughout the 800 years or so. I may mention that as you probably know, that the names still go back to the lineage rather than a family name. So my girlfriend at the time, the lovely Unnur, coming from was Unnur Svensdóttir was the name.
Yeah.
And Svens was Sven Thorir's son. So you have to know all the family lineage to get there. You don't get it through a family name like we have it.
Right, and you're out of luck if the father's name is the same as somebody else's, so that Einar Thorsteinsson.
Then you have to.
Could be several different people.
Then you have to find the occupation, which is also listed in the phone books.
Yeah.
So you are following a very strange track and trying to get a hold of these people. By the way, they all sort of think of this lineage and the stories involved almost in the current day when they say that Ásgeir went over the one of the smaller glaciers, Longjökull, by foot, and he then proceeded to carry out whatever atrocities at the other end. They say, well, Ásgeir was in our family. He was in, so they sort of picture this in all 800 or 1,000 years. One more thing, there were monasteries and there were also some nunneries as well. And occasionally some of the stories relate how they sort of occasionally cohorted with each other, or whatever the word would be. And these two were written down in some of these stories, not necessarily in the sagas.
Yeah, as I mentioned, there are actually a whole bunch of other, if I can call them books, which are essentially long narratives, which are not considered sagas of the Icelanders. The bishop's tales and the stories of the kings, and some others.
Well, it was all oral tradition for many, many hundred years, and then finally was written down. So that's why the wording is so terse.
I'm sorry, I think I missed that.
Oh, the wording is very terse because it was an oral tradition, so it was just passed on. That was something people told, again, then they retold it and retold it. It was changed a little bit, but there were no descriptions. It was just action and very stereotypical description of the people.
Yeah, I think if I heard you correctly, yeah, that's right. It's all descriptions of actions, and it's they're also fairly brief, as you can see from the examples.
John, I was curious about what religion was prominent then, because right now about 2/3 of Iceland is Lutheran, as is, by the way, true of Norway. Do you think it was Catholic, and then when the Norwegians came, they imposed, not imposed, maybe not, influenced the Lutheran thrust?
Well, that's more recent history than I'm knowledgeable about, but I know that the conversion happened in the year 1000, which
predated the Lutherans, of course.
Yeah, so it's a long time before the Protestants and the split, so on. But when the during the 1600s, when that's the time when Bibles were being translated into all sorts of ordinary languages from Latin, Iceland got its own version of the Bible. And I actually, many years ago, had a chance to visit the Library of Congress. And, I asked, and they brought out a copy of the Icelandic Bible from the 1640s. And I was able to look at it. And I knew, a few words of Icelandic, so I could make out a little bit of what was said, but it was, it's in some ways a moving experience to hold in your hands a book that is like, this was over 300 years old, and a famous book too. The
other question?
No, I think I'll just speak a little bit. I know Norway's chief, kings converted around 1000. And, the guys like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson and those type of Vikings had already established trade routes and exploratory routes towards Iceland, Greenland, of course, and Newfoundland and those areas where they found settlements. It's an interesting question, though, so there's that version of Christianity. And then when Lutheranism evolved, there's sort of I think it's by virtue of cultural connection between the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, that they all adopted Lutheran as their choice. Sweden is the outlier. Sweden remained Catholic, and to this day remains culturally a little bit different from Norway, Denmark, and Iceland on that basis. They were an empire in the 1650s. Sweden had colonies and tremendous wealth that Norway certainly didn't have, and Iceland even less. But it's an interesting question to explore that arc of Christianity and then the split, Protestant versus Catholic. I don't think there was any Catholicism per se in Iceland to any degree. At least if it's parallel to Norway.
Right now it's like 3.2% Catholic, Roman Catholic.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's nowadays, but in year 1000, there was no difference.
Well, true.
I have a follow-up question. I have a follow-up question in that you just said Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland as the Nordic. I think of Thor and Odin as being Norse mythology. Does Norse refer to all of the Nordic countries as a whole?
Do you want me to try and answer that, John?
Yeah, you take a shot and then I'll say something too.
Yeah, so certainly linguistically, the Nordic or Scandinavian countries are Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland can be included, even though its version of Scandinavian language is much more ancient. Religiously, that's where it comes in a little bit, towards the 1600s, that Sweden is Catholic versus the other ones that are Protestant. So, but I think if you rely on language as the main marker of culture, all of those are the Scandinavian or Nordic countries. In Norway, when I was a child, we were taught that Nordic was Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Scandinavia included Finland and Iceland, the Faroe Islands and the Shetland Islands.
So Norse is another word for Nordic?
Yeah, and Norse comes from Norway. It's a piece of that.
And a second question is, Jonathan, thank you for mentioning all the online materials. Is it possible to get links to the list of items that you mentioned?
Actually, my email address is johnskinner@verizon.net. And I actually can send you a written copy of what I presented, plus a 4-page annotated bibliography, which will tell you how to find the things. And explain a little bit how I got to the things, or from those items into the talk. So.
Sweden became Protestant Lutheran quite early because the new king needed the money from the monasteries when they kicked out the Danes.
Yeah. I'm having trouble understanding what you're saying because there's so much bubbling in the sound system.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The king needing money for the monastery, she said, but I don't. Okay.
So they became Lutherans because the king decided the religion.
The king decided religion, she said, John. I had a different question for you, John.
Okay.
Has this, or maybe something prior to this, infused you with the idea of knowing more about your own lineage?
Well, I actually have some connection with this since my mother's father was the son of a mixed marriage in Minnesota. The mixed marriage was, Papa was Swedish and mother was Norwegian. And well, the family story was that when the mixed couple would visit the in-laws would deliberately speak their own Nordic language. And of course, they're not mutually understandable. So that would shut out the person who was an in-law rather than a natural member of the family. They could have spoken English. But, Minnesota has actually got a large number of people from all the Scandinavian countries, including Finland, which is quite different from the others linguistically.
So just a comment from Finland being Hungarian, that their language is closer to Hungarian, ironically, which comes from the Ural Mountains or Alto Ural, beyond Urals.
Mm.
But back to Icelandic, they pride themselves that they can read in their vernacular the original sagas. So their language has not changed in before the time of Chaucer, you would say. And that's one reason why they had to change the Bible to their language. They have separate letters for different sounds, like a th sound has a thud, which is a different letter.
Yeah. That's why the transliteration of names will be different. So you find like several different versions of Hallgerd's name. Njáll, I think, is pretty much the same, but Njáll is a curious name because it's actually not Nordic, it's Irish. It's cognate with Neil.
I never heard it in Iceland, ever.
Well, they say that Njáls saga is the most popular and most famous of all the family sagas. And if you go online and look, you can actually find versions of it which are spoofs, you know, people making fun of it, high school kids. So which I think shows that it's really there.
It's interesting to compare that culture of sagas, because in Norway, the most famous one is called Snorre, S-N-O-R-R-E. It does originate in Ireland, or I mean, sorry, from Iceland. I've never heard of Njáls saga before.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I grew up in Norway as a youngster for about 10 years, and it was all Snorre. That was the big thing.
Yeah.
You know, if you wanted to read one of those, and it was translated into modern Norwegian, if you will.
Was that Snorri Sturluson?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he's known to have been writing either during or shortly after the time when all the other sagas were written. And so he's well known in Iceland too, actually.
Gotcha.
Yeah. In fact, you could find translations of his work easily.
Mm-hmm. Into English. Yeah. Thank you, John.
Oh, quite welcome. It's fun to talk about it and study it. I wake up in the morning thinking about it. Bye-bye.
I have to get the book. I hope that the Colony Library here has it as well as Albany.
Well, it wasn't in the Upper Hudson system, so you might have to do interlibrary loan.
Should the friends buy a copy of it, Jonathan? Should we recommend
Or buy a copy. That's
A copy for the library. We got we have enough money. You know, we probably have money to do that.
Well, it's an inexpensive paperback, so it should be easy. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
And
You're welcome.
okay, is anyone else
talking about Iceland? You're mentioning that they have maps to go with it. I have to get the book and see the maps because I want to see if they crossed any of the treks that we had taken when we were there.
Yeah.
Fascinating country, fascinating terrain, and people.
Yeah. Well, I find it fascinating too, even though I've never been there. By the way, the action of Njáls saga, when it's in Iceland, is pretty much in the south and southwestern part along the coast. But the action also goes over into Norway and further afield. And as I mentioned, one of the characters actually ends up in Constantinople, and there are a couple of pilgrimages to Rome, but that's all they say about it. He went to Rome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. This is more interesting than I could have imagined, actually.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Oh, I'm glad you got there.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Bye.
John.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Okay.
you.
You're
Bye.
welcome.
All right. Will, you could probably zap this now. Stop this.
Okay, you guys have a good one. Take care.
You too. Thanks a lot. And thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Will.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks.